Hello, everyone. I'm Sid Melcher, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and I welcome you today to our Instant Issues online event. I'd like to begin by thanking our event sponsors, Glen Meadow, Sir Speedy, and Wilbraham and Munson Academy. And we, as always, remain grateful to NAI Plotkin, 1350 Main Street, LLC, which provides us with office and event space, the latter of which we hope to begin using later this year when we can have in-person events again. Upcoming, we have another Instant Issues online event on Wednesday, March 9th, which will feature author Konstantin Pleshakov, who will speak on Russian foreign policy in 2022, again at noon. If you are not currently on our mailing list, I encourage you to go to our website at wacwestma.org and subscribe to get more information about these and other events. Our speaker today is Bill Scher, who some of you will remember addressed our 2016 annual meeting on the history of foreign policy as a presidential election issue, and then moderated our 2018 annual meeting on global engagement and the American middle class. Bill is a freelance writer and podcaster exploring politics and history through the lens of pragmatism. He is a contributing editor to Politico Magazine, a contributor to Real Clear Politics, and hosts the history podcast When America Worked, True Tales of America's Pragmatist Heroes. He's also co-host of the DMZ online show and podcast with conservative writer Matt Lewis, produced by bloggingheads.tv. In 2006, he authored the book Wait, Don't Move to Canada, a stay and fight strategy to win back America, which later became an answer on Jeopardy. If you have questions for Bill as we go along, please type them into the Q&A box. Today, Bill's topic is He Saved the World, Edward Stettinius and the Creation of the UN. So please join me in welcoming Bill Scher.
Thanks very much, Sid. And I just want to add, writing a lot at the Washington Monthly these days. If you want to catch my work there, that's a good place to find me. And Edward Stettinius is the subject of the inaugural episode of When America Worked. And hopefully I can get to episode 2 sometime soon. But it's a very meaty podcast episode, and I can't address everything in it here. So you're welcome to check that out if I've whetted your appetite. Stettinius is a fascinating figure, in my opinion, because he represents, in my mind, the greatest distance between most good done for the world and least public recognition. I mean, there's almost nobody you will come across who knows who Edward Stettinius is. At best, he's a trivia question. Who was FDR's second Secretary of State, or who was Truman's first Secretary of State, because he wasn't even there that long. Cordell Hull was FDR's Secretary of State for 11 years, longest running Secretary of State ever, and probably a record that will not be broken. And when you see his name crop up in a FDR book or a Truman book, it's almost always in passing, usually kind of dismissive. He never gained a lot of respect when he was alive, and hasn't gained a whole lot of respect after his death. But there are a couple of books out there that do give him the credit for making the United Nations happen, and much of my podcast and talk here relies on those 2 books. And one is Masquerade Peace by Thomas Campbell, and the other is Act of Creation by Stephen Schlesinger. So Stettinius was the son of Edward Stettinius Sr., who was a Gilded Age self-made man who became, according to the historian Ron Chernow, the father of the military-industrial complex. He was tapped by the Wilson administration to essentially put the war machine together, get all the private industry to start turning their attention towards producing war material in advance of then the Great War, before we even declared war, because Wilson saw it on the horizon. The Allies needed help, and Stettinius Jr. Came of age in the progressive era, and his father once criticized his socialist leanings. But he followed in his father's footsteps initially. He went on to the board of he was an executive at General Motors, where Stettinius Sr. was on the board. And when FDR got elected, he had already developed the reputation of being a progressive businessman, and FDR liked that and wanted people like that to help with the New Deal and to create a partnership between government and big business. So he was tapped to help with that. And then when World War II was heating up, again, before war was declared by the US, he was brought in. At this point, he had already gone back into the private sector to chair US Steel. FDR brings him back in to help with the war effort. He heads up the Lend-Lease program. And then, during that time, this is around 1940, there is a sex scandal, totally unrelated to Stettinius at the time. But it's kind of this butterfly effect thing, where if this sex scandal doesn't happen, perhaps Stettinius doesn't become Secretary of State and create the United Nations. Sumner Welles was the Undersecretary of State. Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State. Cordell Hull was sort of an old school Paul, Southern, more conservative. He was there for political reasons. So FDR had a bridge to the Southern Democrats. Hull was someone who was considered presidential material at one point. FDR considered him for VP. But Cordell Hull wanted to stay where he was at State. And Sumner Welles was in FDR's social circle growing up in the New York area, upper crust, went to the same schools as FDR. FDR helped him get his first gig in diplomatic corps. And he was a page at FDR's wedding. So there was a closer personal bond there. And FDR had much more respect for Sumner Welles's foreign policy acumen than Cordell Hull's. And very early on, there was a turf war brewing between Hull and Welles over who was going to really control the UN project. FDR was preparing to push for a UN very early on the onset of World War II. Before it was really public knowledge that he was going to be doing that. FDR was in the Wilson administration. He was a Wilsonian. He won the League of Nations. He was when he ran for VP in 1920, he was a champion of the League of Nations. So he wanted to finish what Wilson started. Was aware that Wilson was aware of the mistakes that Wilson made, and wanted to get ahead of the curve. So excuse me for jumping around a little bit. But the crux of the tension between Welles and Hull's different views of the UN was that Hull wanted a structure that centralized power more with the big four: US, UK, China, Russia, and Welles had a more democratic vision with global regions and power being spread more diffusely. And beyond the ideological differences that they had, there's also just straight up, turf war, personal desire to be in control. But in 1940, during the general election campaign, the Speaker of the House died, who was a Southern Democrat, Alabama, William Bankhead. And FDR did not want to offend Southern Democrats in the campaign, so he made sure to have a big funeral contingent go down to Alabama on the president's train. Cordell Hull was older than Welles, and he was sick a lot and couldn't make it, so Welles goes in Hull's place. And on the way back, after hours, Sumner Welles is roaring drunk, and he's calling in the African-American Pullman rail car pointers and sexually propositioning them. And offering sex for money. The porters do not oblige. One reports it to his superiors. Now, this isn't the modern day, so it doesn't get thrown up on the internet, 24 hours later. It didn't get in the news, but there still was a time of gossip. So, and it's the president's train. So there are people gossiping about this. And this gets to not just Cordell Hull, but a guy named William Bullitt. And those of us in Western Mass might be familiar with the Bullitt Reservation over in Ashfield. It is that Bullitt. William Bullitt later on in life had invited Richard Nixon up there to Ashfield for a vacation. Bullitt had been ambassador to Russia under Wilson, and also ambassador to France, and he wanted Welles's job. So he was angry at Welles that he got blocked out of that, and so he wanted revenge on Welles, and Hull wasn't happy with Welles. Bullitt goes into FDR's office with this gossip and says, "You got to get rid of this guy." Cordell Hull says he's a security risk and he's a degenerate. And FDR's initial response was, "Well, Napoleon was a degenerate too. He told me he's not going to do that stuff anymore. Don't worry about it." And so he keeps it under wraps for years. And but Bullitt and Hull kind of feed the gossip mill over 3 years. And Bullitt goes back into FDR's office back in 1943. It's a more heated confrontation. FDR raises his voice to Bullitt. "What you're doing to Welles is unchristian. So what if he does that when he's been drinking?" Then there is some gossip in the papers that there's tension between Hull and Welles, which makes Hull sense his opportunity, goes back to FDR, basically says, "Look, it's him or me." And FDR sort of sees the writing on the wall, worries that this will get out if he doesn't comply. Goes to Welles, asks him to take a lower position. Welles says, "Forget it, I'm just going to resign completely." And that is that. And FDR brings in Stettinius over from the Lend-Lease program, thinking he's not going to cause any problems. He doesn't have any diplomatic experience, doesn't have a foreign policy vision. He's not going to get in Hull's way. More importantly, he's not going to get in FDR's way, because FDR wants to drive this train. And that was seen as a safe pick. So Hull then has control over the building of the UN, the crafting of the initial charter, and Stettinius has no role in that. Stettinius doesn't really get into the game until the Dunbar and Oaks Conference, which is tail end of 1943. And because Hull was sick, and so Stettinius got tasked with managing the conference, and did not make a good impression with the media. Stettinius was keeping the media at bay. They did not have access to the proceedings. The media was grumbly about that. Stettinius tried to do press conferences to keep him happy, but they were kind of bumbling, and so he was further developing a reputation of being in over his head. But Stettinius very cannily recognized that there was this very sticky problem. This is a conference that had the UK and Soviet Union and China represented, and they were not in agreement over how expansive veto power would be. And this is a very sensitive subject, because in defining veto power, you're defining how much power these four countries have over the entire world. And the question was whether, if there was a dispute that involved your country, does that country get to veto that situation? And the Soviets and Stalin basically said, "Hey, if we can't veto a matter that involves us, then you capitalist countries are just going to steamroll us, and this is not on an even plane. We're not governing by consensus here. This only works if it's a consensus deal." So they couldn't come to a resolution on that at Dunbar and Oaks. Stettinius says, "Hey, let's just put a pin in this. Let's have a placeholder in the draft charter, and we'll take it up at the next conference that we have." And by doing it that way, it avoided being a public controversy. The concern was that if it was publicly controversial, that could have totally poisoned the conversation and might have taken all the talks down. So Stettinius keeps that under wraps and develops a proposal with Hull's right-hand man, a guy named Pozlowski, to say, if the matter is of a pacific nature, then you don't get to veto a matter that involves you. But if it's a military matter, then you can. And so you're retaining essentially a sovereign right to use military power. And that proposal gets brought to the famed Yalta Conference. This is an early 19. I'm getting my years wrong. That's 40. That's 45. I'm sorry, Dunbar's doing 44. I think Yalta's 45. Excuse me if I'm getting my numbers wrong. And so FDR is nominally in favor of this proposal, but then on the way over, he then throws a curveball at Stettinius and says, Jimmy Burns in my administration, he thinks we should that the Big Four shouldn't have the veto power at all. We should push for that. And this horrifies Stettinius. He thinks that's great. That's crazy talk. And it seemed to indicate that FDR wasn't really focused on the political sensitivities of this issue. And so one of, I think, early decisions that Stettinius makes that is really important is that he flat out ignores FDR and goes forth on his own plan, meeting with FDR and Churchill and Stalin at Yalta and laying out the proposal in full and really convincing Churchill, and most importantly Stalin, who was the biggest skeptic about it, to accept that plan. And Churchill and Stalin both praise Stettinius's presentation. They come around, but the Soviet Union then sees an opportunity to then ask for concessions, having done the conciliatory thing in regards to the veto. And they say, you know what? We really think we should get 2 more votes in the General Assembly of the UN. We want you to admit what we now call Ukraine and Belarus. And the UK, they get Canada, they get Australia, they're part of the Commonwealth. So this is really the same kind of thing. So Churchill was sympathetic to that argument. Roosevelt was a more hesitant, but he wanted to get support for admitting several Latin American nations that he thought would be friendly to US interests. And several of those nations had not formally declared war on the Axis powers, on Germany and Japan. And so Stalin and the rest of them agree, well, if they do declare war, if they do take that step, even at this late stage of the game, then they can come in, but not Argentina. We know Argentina is too close to the Nazis. They can't play. So that was one of the agreements at Yalta. Another big one was involving Poland, because Poland at this point was essentially being dominated by the Soviets. The US and the UK wanted Poland to be independent and democratic. And they come to an agreement that essentially says that Poland would be democratic. And so those 3 things, the veto, Argentina, Poland, the latter 2, Stettinius didn't have a big role in, but those 3 things all come to a head at the subsequent San Francisco conference in the spring of 1945. And just as an example of how, when we talk about the creation of the UN, we really talk about it. It just seems like this thing just sort of happened. The World War II ended and the UN was created because everyone was sad that the League of Nations didn't happen. And done and done. And it was much more complicated than that. And those 3 things were some of the biggest sticking points that Stettinius had to end up navigating in leading the American delegation to San Francisco. Now, between Yalta and San Francisco was the Mexico City Conference involving the Latin American nations. And this is the first time that we now know that Stettinius was using surveillance, clandestine surveillance by the precursor of what's now the NSA, National Security Agency. Then it was the US Army Signal Security Agency. That was spying on various allied nations and learning what their sticking points and hangups were in regards to the UN. And so Stettinius was picking up early on that the Latin American nations were really determined to bring Argentina along and might not agree to be part of the UN if Argentina was left behind. So this was, again, a very, very sensitive topic. It seemed to be a deal breaker for Stalin at Yalta, but Stettinius goes to Mexico City. What he hears on the intercepts and what he's hearing in person convince him that they have to find a way to get Argentina in there. He communicates that to FDR. And another diplomat, Nelson Rockefeller, in the State Department, he is on board with getting Argentina in. And it's a little unclear exactly how much Stettinius is involved here because there was no paperwork. But essentially, it appears that Stettinius and Rockefeller do an end run around the rest of state because most of the State Department were not fans of Argentina. And they secretly go to Juan Perón, who was effectively leading Argentina. And even though Argentina wasn't willing to come on board with declaring war at the Mexico City conference, they were very reluctant. They didn't want it to seem like they're being pushed around by the US. With some additional back channel diplomacy after Mexico City, they finally get Argentina to do that. And the US recognizes them in early April, although the Soviet Union does not. But this is laying the groundwork for getting Argentina admitted to the United Nations. And right after this, FDR dies. And Truman hasn't been vice president for very long. It's only been, I think about a month at this point. He's playing cards in the Senate when he's told to get over to the White House right away. He gets there and he's told by Eleanor that the president has died, and Truman says, oh my God, what can I do to help you? And Eleanor says, the question is, what can we do for you? Because you're the one in trouble now. And at that point, Stettinius, under the lines of succession, Stettinius is next in line to the presidency. It's not Speaker of the House at this point, Secretary of State. So again, here's a guy who was basically, a corporate executive with minimal diplomatic experience, all of a sudden second line of the presidency. And the very first thing that Truman and Stettinius have to do that night is decide, is the San Francisco conference going to go on as planned, which is scheduled for later that month? And this is a time when the Soviet Union is being very difficult. Poland's not looking good. Romania is not looking good. They're really concerned the Soviet Union is not willing to be a cooperative actor in this process. And there was a push inside the FDR White House to delay the conference. But Stettinius goes to Truman, you should declare tonight that the conference will go on as scheduled. And Truman agrees. And Truman says to Stettinius, and you're going to lead the delegation. You're going to do a fantastic job, because that wasn't established yet. So that's really the first substantive decision Truman makes as president, and it was at Stettinius's behest. And to Stettinius, he thought, well, it looks like the new president are going to get off on a good foot. As it turned out, Stettinius thought Truman thought Stettinius was an idiot. And later told a biographer that he never had a idea, new or old, and was already almost immediately was going to Jimmy Burns and saying, "Hey, first chance they get, I'm going to make you Secretary of State." And those rumors got to San Francisco and were hanging over Stettinius's head during the whole time he was there. But he still is Secretary of State at this time. He still goes to San Francisco. And immediately, Stalin's top diplomat, Molotov, the namesake of the Molotov cocktail, who is known as a very hard bargainer, he immediately is pushing to admit Poland as a member of the UN, and he actually meets with Truman, and they have a very contentious meeting. And the other thing that's important here is that they not just want Belarus and Ukraine seated, he wants them seated right away, be part of the voting at the San Francisco conference. And Nelson Rockefeller is not even invited to San Francisco, but he crashes the party anyway, and meets with the American delegation. And this is all happening in Stettinius' penthouse suite at the Fairmont Hotel. And he tells the group that the only way you're going to get the votes for Belarus and Ukraine is by admitting Argentina. And most of this delegation, again, not fans of Argentina. This notion that they're starting to pivot towards being friendly is not widely accepted in the delegations, not widely accepted in much of the State Department. And now this guy who's not even invited to be part of the delegation is making demands, and that's driving Stettinius up the wall, even though he agrees that they do have to find a way to get Argentina in. He just doesn't like the way Nelson Rockefeller is going about doing it and being so antagonistic. But he does conclude that they have to find a way to trade the admission of Belarus and Ukraine for Argentina. He tries to, he's got Truman on board. He calls Truman. Truman's kind of grumbly about it, but accepts Stettinius' claim that this has to be to meet what was agreed upon at Yalta in terms of Belarus and Ukraine. This is the only way we're going to get to do it. This comes up at an early executive session meeting at the San Francisco conference with the heads of all the different 46 delegations. But Molotov then throws onto the fire admitting Poland. And that throws the proceedings in disarray. And actually, it wasn't Molotov directly that proposed it. They got Czechoslovakia to do it. A Czechoslovakia delegate later complained to an American at the hotel bar, what can one do with these Russians? You can be on your knees and it's not enough. So everyone knew that it was Russia, throwing their weight around. But they managed to not have a vote on Poland up or down. Even though they do vote on Belarus and Ukraine right away, the Soviets don't agree to vote on Argentina. The Americans don't agree to vote on Poland. And after some back and forth with the different delegations, finally Stettinius, there's actually a point where one of the Americans, Arthur Vandenberg, was a Republican member of the delegation. This was FDR's insight that they could not have a partisan delegation to San Francisco. He knew that Wilson went about the League of Nations in too partisan a way and got the treaty blocked largely by Republicans in the Senate. So he was determined to make this a bipartisan endeavor. And Vandenberg, who was a former isolationist Republican turned internationalist, was a key member. But Vandenberg was very suspicious of the Soviets. And when this Poland thing was going down, he slips a note to Stettinius. And I should also say Vandenberg was the one person who voted against seating Belarus and Ukraine. He was a lone dissenting voice in the American delegation. So he was he was unsure about Stettinius going in. He thought Stettinius was not up to the job, should not have been leading the delegation. He slips this note to Stettinius, this basically saying, we did what we said we would do in terms of Belarus and Ukraine. We're adhering to the Yalta Agreement now, so you need to adhere to the Yalta Agreement when it comes to Poland and have to be independent and democratic. Stettinius reads the Vandenberg note verbatim, which sends Vandenberg over the moon, and all of a sudden he thinks Stettinius is the greatest guy. But it doesn't move the Soviets. They don't budge. And finally, Stettinius just forces the issue. He forces an up or down vote on the admission of Argentina, wins that vote over opposition of the Soviets and a few others. And there was a lot of upset in America for Stettinius doing that. In fact, Cordell Hull was complaining on his hospital bed that Stettinius should not be doing this. And it's one of those key points where we talk about how much does it matter that one individual was in a position versus another individual. We know that Cordell Hull opposed ceding Argentina and Stettinius was for it. So if Stettinius was not there, this deal does not get made. And if this deal does not get made, the Latin Americans likely walk out of the conference and you don't have a United Nations. So it's very significant that he pushed for that vote. He won that vote, even though there are people in the State Department who are upset with him. There was open criticism in the media for him doing it. There was editorials saying this was sort of crass power politics, not what the UN was supposed to be about. Molotov was holding court and mocking the Americans for being hypocrites and playing footsie with this fascist nation and getting praise in America for doing that. But nevertheless, Stettinius not only won that vote, he managed to do it without getting the Soviets so riled up that they walked out of the conference. Molotov said soon afterwards, everything's going to go smoothly from here on out, which wasn't true, but it just indicated that the Soviets were still interested in making the UN happen. The two other big things that Stettinius had to navigate was again, well, first before the veto, there was an issue about how are you going to deal with all of these countries that were under German or Japanese authority, and now they're liberated after World War II. Who are we giving up the spoils? Do the great powers get to claim their colonies, their protectorates, or are they going to be independent nations? And the UK and also France, they want to keep on to their colonial possessions as long as possible. So they didn't want any language in the charter that talked about independence. They're okay with self-determination, but not independence. And there was going to be a trusteeship council that would basically decide what would happen with these countries. And so the language would be written around describing what this trusteeship council is trying to accomplish. And the Soviets and the Chinese were quite comfortable with independence because they weren't the ones that had the colonial possession. So they were encouraging independence. Stettinius does a couple of crafty things. One is that he says, look, this doesn't apply for lands that countries currently hold. So we're not trying to take things away from England, not trying to take things away from France that they currently have. And there's also a special designation for areas that have strict military purposes, because there are areas of the Pacific that the US wanted to put military bases in. So they exempted those. And most of the language talked about self-determination, but he slips in one reference to independence as sort of like a long-term goal for these nations. And that compromise was copacetic with the other big countries. In fact, Stettinius had some intel that the French were going to be okay with that. And the smaller nations, the Latin countries, were not thrilled with this compromise. They thought this was going to leave them out in the cold. And they wanted to press the big four. It actually became the big five because France was left out of the big four initially. And then they kind of came around during the San Francisco conference. They're not going to be part of this, the permanent members of the Security Council. The smaller nations team up and submit 23 questions to the big powers, trying to clarify the veto and how it would really work in practice. And those are questions that threaten to create division amongst the big five, because they're involved in interpretations of language that they hadn't settled on yet. And they got through most of them without a problem, except for one big one, which is, does the veto power apply to procedural matters? And if you're going to say that it does, then you can veto a procedural question, then you can essentially prevent a matter from even getting a hearing at the UN. And so that was not going to be sufficient for the smaller nations. The Americans and the British were good with saying, okay, procedural matters don't count. They can't be vetoed. The Soviets said initially, that's not okay with us. And there was a lot of begging and pleading from the US saying this whole thing could go down if you don't agree to this one. But Gromyko was the number 3 guy, Andrei Gromyko. Gromyko and Molotov were holding the line. And so Stettinius decides, this is one of the last big things that Stettinius did that's really important. He had gotten the sense that there were times when Molotov acted without Stalin's knowledge. And he thought if they could go around Molotov and appeal to Stalin directly, they could fix this problem. And one of FDR's top guys, Harry Hopkins, had been sent to Moscow mostly to deal with the Poland question. And he had just essentially ceded Poland to the Soviets and essentially stood down. So we're not going to insist that they dressed it up in some diplomatic language, but the bottom line was really that we understand that we're not going to really get an independent Poland out of this. So after taking that dive, Hopkins and Stalin having developed a working relationship, a telegram was sent to Hopkins to press Stalin about this veto question. And Molotov was there too. And Molotov goes to Stalin, tries to explain, because Stalin did not know what was going on here. And Molotov tried to explain why the Soviets why they took the stance they did. And Stalin cuts him off and says, this is insignificant. Just, stand down on this one. And so once that was done, that seals the deal. That is what ensures that this UN charter is going to happen. And Stettinius is the guy that navigated all these sticky situations. And what was his reward? His reward was Truman sending an emissary shortly before the final ceremony to basically say, you're not going to be Secretary of State anymore, but we're going to give you a bigger job. We're going to make you the first ambassador to the UN. That's much more important than the State Department. And Stettinius is not quite buy into it, but doesn't see where else he can go from here. He extracts some concessions from Truman in terms of how the announcement will be handled and having direct line communication between him and the president. That sort of thing. So he accepts that deal, but Stettinius finds out right away that he's not being respected. He doesn't have a say in the decision making. Jimmy Burns is calling the shots. And so after a year, Stettinius quits in a huff and essentially establishes the precedent that the UN ambassador is not that relevant, not as important a position as Secretary of State. And so Stettinius then tries a few other endeavors. He writes a book about Roosevelt and the Russians, defending Roosevelt's foreign policy. He tries a charitable project in Liberia that doesn't fly. His finances become shaky, and he ends up dying of a heart attack in 1949. And he was 49 years old, just 49 years old. He dies of a heart attack. And so when he dies, not only so the other important thing here I should add is in 1945, the Nobel Peace Prize is given to Cordell Hull as father of the United Nations. When FDR accepted Cordell Hull's resignation right after Dunbar and Oaks, which elevated Stettinius to Secretary of State, Roosevelt christened Hull the father of the United Nations. And in Hull's own memoirs, he takes a swipe at Dunbar and Oaks and says, look, most of the work was done beforehand. What happened I took a swipe at San Francisco, I should say. What happened in San Francisco, that's what happened before. That's the trunk of the tree. Those are the roots in the trunk. If you take that away, all you're left with are the branches. You don't have the trunk or the roots. And that's generally been the view of how the UN got created. There's not even a plaque at the UN that commemorates Stettinius. These guys, there's no public recognition for what he accomplished. And when he dies in 1949, this is when the Korean War is breaking out and Berlin Wall is going up, and the communists taking over China. So no one's even looking at the UN as being this great saving grace at that point in time. So he never ever gets the credit he deserves in his own time, and not afterwards. Because even today, people look at the UN as kind of a paper thin organization, glorified debating society. But there is a report that came out several years ago by an operation called the Human Security Report Project, and they had credited the UN with for a large amount of the credit for the dramatic reduction of war-related deaths. In 1950, globally, there were 240 war-related deaths per 1 million in population, and by 2007, that had gone from 240 to less than 10. And they also note that there was a five-fold increase in the number of diplomatic interventions intended to bring armed conflicts to a negotiated settlement after the Cold War ended. The UN gets involved in civil wars like Cambodia and El Salvador and Guatemala and Liberia and Mozambique. These are things that don't become that well known because there's that early intervention that prevents them from getting out of hand and turning into world wars. We don't have world wars anymore. And something else that was pointed out in the Schlesinger book, Act of Creation, is that the UN sparks an almost total decolonization of the world. And he quotes a former UN official, Sir Brian Urquhart, said, getting that independence language, even though it was just a little bit of independence, it still signaled that this was a core principle of the Council's work. And it was that rhetorical fuel needed to move all of these nations away from being colonial projects and being independent nations. Just to wrap up here, I think Stettinius is a fantastic example on a number of fronts. One, not judging a book by its cover. He was someone who wasn't, he didn't have the diplomatic experience going in, but he had the right kind of temperament, had the right kind of judgment, and that ended up being more important. At a time when people don't always love things like government surveillance, and is always seen as something that is underhanded and devious, that this is one of the few document examples that we know of being used for peace purposes, using it properly to identify problems and develop strategies to head them off in the past so they don't get out of hand. The fact that FDR ensured a bipartisan delegation, I thought was very important. We talk about what's the value of bipartisanship in these polarized times, and there's plenty of polarization in the 20th century too. League of Nations went down because of polarization, and it's a reminder that if you can depolarize these issues, you can do really big things. And it's also a reminder that diplomacy still has its merits, even though we don't always give the UN the credit that it deserves, that it has been a huge force for good in the world. So I'll leave it there, and I'll leave it open for any questions that you folks might have.
So if anybody, thank you, Bill. Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. While we're waiting for questions, I might be putting you on the spot here. I know, I suspect that some of our audience members might be, as you are, fans of presidential biography. And I'm wondering if your book club is open to new people.
Oh, yes. So I'm also the vice president of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum Standing Committee, which is part of the Forbes Library here in Northampton. And we've been running a presidential book club for a while now, just going in order, one a month, generally speaking. We're on Coolidge right now. We're meeting on the 28th to talk Coolidge, the Amity Schley's book called Coolidge. And then we're going into Hoover and FDR. We're gonna do two FDR sessions. So yes, new members are allowed at any time. So if you want to ping me, billschermedia@gmail.com, probably best way to get me. It's BILLSCHERMEDIA@gmail.com. Let me know and I'll get you on our list. We got one question I
We
see
have
in the
one
Q&A.
question.
Do you think the UN would not have been established but for Stettinius? I mean, I think there's a strong argument to make there. Again, I think there are several things that he did that Cordell Hull would not have done. I mean, the biggest one being Argentina. If you don't do that Argentina deal, and if the Latin American countries walk out, I mean, if you don't have a big region of the world in your UN, you don't have much of a UN. And if they walked out, who knows who else might have walked out and said, look, this just isn't happening here, people. So there just were, and you needed somebody. I mean, I can't know if Hull would have done what Stettinius did when it came to the independence language or resolving the veto question with Stalin. Those sorts of things I can't as easily say only Stettinius could have done. But sort of the clandestine diplomacy to Juan Perón before San Francisco and the Belarus, Ukraine, Argentina swap are things I can say definitively. I mean, Cordell Hull said in his memoir that he opposed it and wasn't happy with what Stettinius did. So I think it was a big decision that Stettinius made. And if that doesn't happen, I don't think the UN happens.
We have another question. Now that correlation does not equal causation, what evidence is there that it was the UN that has caused a decline in international violence?
Well, I mean, I don't think you can say that, the UN is the single cause. And there's probably no way you can easily separate all the various, factors that could come into play. I mean, there obviously was a general revulsion towards World War following the two that we had in the 20th century. But what is a fact is the UN does do these interventions. They do get involved at a much earlier stage of these conflagrations. Something that it didn't exist, it didn't occur pre-World War II. So we have documented examples of the UN getting involved in these relatively low-level disputes and preventing them from escalating. And so to me, it's a bit of an Occam's razor. They were doing this now, they weren't doing it then, and you see benefit. We don't have the same kind of cascading effect of secret alliances that existed with World War I, where someone shoots the Archduke and then this domino effect occurs, and all of a sudden all these players are piled on top of each other having a shooting war. We have more open discussion of these kind of disputes and not the same kind of secret alliances because we have some kind of organized structure around having that kind of conversation. Now, at the same time, the thing that Sumner Wells wanted, these sort of regional spheres of influence, we have more of that than I think Cordell Hull initially envisioned, NATO being the most obvious example. And there's also there's like an organization of American states, that the Latin American nations are part of. So there are things like that that have their roles too, that I think also play a significant role. So you can't say that it's just the UN, and it certainly has evolved in its vision and structure for how it was initially envisioned. Certainly, the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviets is not what people thought it was going to be in 1945. But I certainly think you have a lot less large-scale conflict because the UN existed if it was not there at all.
So follow-up question, where is the UN in the conflict in Ukraine today?
Well, here's an example where the UN, I'm not speaking from a knowledgeable place. I don't know exactly what kind of diplomatic activity is happening. Whatever they are doing, I doubt is the UN's not gonna be the one that solves this problem. I think that's a safe thing to say. Once you have dispute, within your Security Council, it's not the consensus of the Security Council imposing its will on everybody else. You got division within the Security Council, Permanent Security Council. That's always harder. Now, I do suspect that even no matter how bad Ukraine gets, it's not going to be World War III. And the fact that there is a UN where both Russia and the US play a role in global governance, I think has some relevance to that. But NATO is a huge part of what's going to happen with Ukraine now. I mean, that's sort of, it's the US plus NATO that is having the negotiations with the Russians. It's not the UN brokering a deal. I mean, maybe they will step in. I don't expect them to. So it's not that the UN is like the magic fairy dust that solves every single problem. But if you didn't have that, if you didn't have any kind of structure that says, you know what, there are a whole bunch of decisions, a whole bunch of things that we do jointly, I think a situation like Ukraine could spiral out of control a whole lot easier.
Okay, are there any more questions? Okay, so I will thank you, Bill, again, and thank you to our audience. And I hope to see you again on March 9th when we have our program on Russian foreign policy in 2022, speaking of Ukraine. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you all.